Every city has a shadow. It's the things we don't see that we choose not to see or teach ourselves not to see. What we don't see still exists, though. It works out of sight behind our backs, and it's all the more powerful because it's unobserved. We underestimate what we don't notice. We mount no defense against what we never see. No matter where you live, I guarantee that something near you unraveled while you slept last night. Things do that. They fall apart. They do it constantly without cease. Steel doesn't need your permission to rust. Wood doesn't require legislation to rot. Last night, wherever you are, pavement cracked a bit more, and another weed seed germinated, someplace dark and out of sight. That falling apart, whether you call it decay or entropy or disorder, is a force with power, and it never stops. There's even a thermodynamic law about it. For a lot of us, the cities in which we live are great examples of this, either as a whole or in part. Those parts may be places we try not to go, but they exist all the same, even when they are out of sight. If you're someone who studies cities or governs them or shapes them in any way, this unraveling is not something you talk about much, or perhaps not something you want to look at. Cities are supposed to grow. For a lot of us concerned with cities, our particular take on them is predicated on growth, particularly continual building and land development. It's an article of faith that our city will continue to build. To look at the opposing force, at decay and disorder, feels a lot like failure. It feels like that fear that keeps you up at night. In fact, a lot of our top fears fall into the category of things falling apart. Whether you worry about climate change or crime, or whether your car will get you home from work tonight. Things can come apart in terms of how we get along with each other, how systems work, or how structures endure. Neglect is this falling apart that affects cities like yours and mine. Neglect means it's something someone has looked away from. Neglect is what happens behind your back. Neglect is also a verb, and you can neglect something by ignoring it or not seeing its distress, but also by not paying for what it needs. These are fundamental statements, but you get the idea. Neglect is all the ways, big and small, that cities unravel. No matter what city you think of, neglect is shaping it right now. Neglect is a constant because there's always something we should be paying attention to but can't afford. The bottom of someone's to-do list is tomorrow's neglect. Neglect doesn't need our permission. It doesn't need us to notice it to be at work. In fact, our inattention can turbocharge neglect. It's a shaping by unintentional consequence. It's powerful because we don't pay attention to it. It thrives on passivity and apathy. If neglect shapes the environment of your city, it's influencing you, too, through that environment. You probably don't notice how it affects you, and once again, that makes neglect a little more powerful. That's sinister. And it should be, because neglect hurts us. And it hurts some of us a lot more than others. Except when it doesn't. Neglect in some ways shapes urban environments in ways that benefit us. Some of us, some of the time, are better off because of neglect. This is ambiguous, which is what makes it worth learning about. It's also worth learning about because it's an unstoppable force that's shaping our cities, as you read this, in ways that affect our health, our climate, and our opportunities in life. It's working right now, outside your window or behind your back. It's just out of sight. Never enough money. In too many cities, it's been a long time now since there was enough to go around. Enough money, enough labor, enough staffing, enough political will, but really it all comes down to enough money. Rust Belt decline and shrinking cities are often portrayed as a new or newly urgent problem, but really they aren't. There's nothing at all new about this decline or about the disinvestment in cities that has accompanied it. In a strange twist, the lack of newness is exactly why it matters. These are long-term trends, and thus their effects are much bigger. Because they are long-term, they are more difficult to stop or to reverse. It's not a bad year or a bad decade or someone's poor governance during his term in office. It's 40 years or more. 1950 is usually cited as the peak year of urban population, or the year in which the most people actually lived within the city itself, not its many suburbs or neighboring bedroom communities. And friends, 1950 was a long time ago, over 60 years at this writing. This atmosphere of scarcity in our cities is not a blip, and the next election won't change it. So here's a bit of logic. It's pretty basic, but it escaped my notice for many years, even as I learned about, shaped, and studied cities, because it happens out of sight. That persistent atmosphere of scarcity, the budget that's never big enough, the coffers that are always overdrawn, what that means is choices. Just as in your own home or your own life, when there's not enough money to go around, you choose where to spend what you do have. In city governance, there are all kinds of possible shenanigans involving deficit spending and various ways to rob Peter and pay Paul, but really, are those so different from credit cards in our own homes? Not really. When times are tight at home, you might opt to pay the electric bill and avoid eating out, if you're able to cook at home and shop for groceries. If you do this enough, say if times are tight for 60 years, you will always have the lights on and never eat out. The electric company wins, and the restaurant down the street loses. Although your intent was to keep the lights on, you may find that you weigh less and thus escape the host of obesity-related diseases with which we are plagued because you have eaten home cooking for 60 years instead of more caloric restaurant food. You may also enjoy better health due to dodging the related host of diet and nutrition-related diseases with which we are plagued, because again, you've not eaten at a restaurant in 60 years. So you likely consume less salt, for example. You've undoubtedly become a great cook with all that practice. Your pots and pans have gotten a lot of wear. You've been at home for 60 years of dinner time telemarketer calls. Your kitchen has needed to be cleaned frequently with all that use. You may be very tired of mac and cheese and spaghetti. All of these are consequences of your choice, repeated consistently over decades, to pay for electricity and not for eating out. They are unintended, yet consequences all the same. Some are positive and some are negative. You could say that you've neglected to fund eating out for 60 years and thus caused all these consequences, good and bad. The big hypothesis. Couldn't the same thing happen with city budgets and competing priorities for municipal resources? If, for example, police protection and trash collection always get funded, and they are important, what doesn't get funded to provide for them? What's the dining out in this comparison? And is it always the same priorities or tasks or programs that don't get funded? And what does that mean? This book is about a question, a hypothesis, and what's already known about it, what new connections can be drawn between those bits of existing knowledge, and what new insights can be produced from examining all this material together. The central hypothesis is this. All these bits and pieces are observed effects and outcomes from a larger trend or dynamic, neglect. Decades of scarcity have resulted in the same priorities going unfunded repeatedly, and those unfunded priorities express themselves in the physical environment of our cities in consistent and predictable ways. In short, neglect is a major yet unnoticed shaper of our cities. An intriguing subhypothesis: some impacts of this neglect may be positive. We urban residents may actually be better off in some ways because of the environment created by neglect.